He blamed the internet, video games, mental illness and hatred. Everything, in fact, except guns. President Trump called the weekend's terrorist attack in Texas and mass shooting in Ohio crimes against all humanity, urging the nation to condemn racism, bigotry and white supremacy with one voice. But Mr. Trump's critics have accused him of open racism and white nationalism and for linking calls for tougher background checks for gun owners to immigration reform. Our reporter Danny Isdale is in El Paso, where 22 people are now confirmed to have lost their lives. Danny.
Well, Krishnan, we report on US mass shootings with disturbing regularity, and you can set your clock by what happens in the aftermath. There's the blanket wall-to-wall coverage, the condolences, and the calls for greater gun control that seem to amount to nothing too often. And in this case, there is a different element in the mix. With El Paso, it's being investigated as a hate crime. And Donald Trump is being called out for his use of racist and anti-immigrant rhetoric and behaviours over the course of his presidency. He said today that hatred warps the mind, ravages the heart and devours the soul. But it is his mind, heart and soul that is being criticised today. So what has he done about it? Well, he has certainly not taken any responsibility or even acknowledged that his behaviour could have played some role. And on gun control, no substantive reform has been announced. He has blamed the internet, he's blamed mental health, even though he, in 2017, repealed Obama-era laws which made it more difficult for people with mental health conditions to obtain weapons. So today, for the people of El Paso, for the people of Dayton, they feel that their president has failed them.
We have a president right now who traffics in this hatred, who incites this violence, who calls asylum seekers animals and an infestation.
Animals, infestation, two words the migrant community in El Paso have heard too often. Now it's thoughts and prayers. They don't want to hear those either. They want change, and they want it now.
Run out that way. Hurry up, run out that way. Hurry up, hurry up.
The El Paso Walmart was packed with mostly Hispanic families buying school supplies on Saturday morning when a gunman walked in and opened fire. Mothers died protecting their infants. Panicked grandparents told what to do by their grandchildren who'd practiced active shooter drills at school. It's being investigated as a hate crime.
I'm sad, but I'm feeling okay. Yeah. I'm sad of what happened, but I'm feeling okay.
Alicia Vila has lived in El Paso all her 71 years. She'd dropped her car off for an oil change at the Walmart garage, then waited in the store.
So I saw this family running towards the back, and I said, "What's going on?" And he said, "Run, run, there's a shooter inside Walmart." And when he said there's a shooter, I heard like 5 shots, like bang, 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 and I was like, oh my God. So I just turned around and started running.
1,500 miles away in Dayton, Ohio, more gunshots, more candles, more grief.
Do something!
And more demands to politicians over this country's seemingly incurable addiction to guns. On Saturday night, a gunman wearing body armour fired at people enjoying a night out, killing 9 and injuring 26. He was shot by police as he approached the door of a bar where many of those fleeing had run to hide.
Had this individual made it through the doorway of Ned Pepper's, with that level of weaponry, there would have been a catastrophic injury and loss of life.
With more than 30 dead in a 13-hour period, a nation looked to its leader. Many weren't seeking comfort, but laying blame.
They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists.
His anti-immigrant rhetoric was deafening when he ran, and once he won, it became even louder.
As you look at what's marching up, that's an invasion. That's an invasion.
Then this, at a rally in Florida in May.
But how do you stop these people? You can't. There's no... That's only in the panhandle you can get away with that statement.
In addition to the racism and the hatred...
For Democratic presidential hopeful Beto O'Rourke, Donald Trump is the cause of the rise in hate crimes. His words embolden white supremacists. And as long as he's in charge, there won't be a solution.
Is there anything in your mind that the president can do now to make this any better?
What do you think? You know what he's been saying? He's been calling Mexican immigrants rapists and criminals. I don't know, like, members of the press, what the f? Hold on a second. You know, it's these questions that you know the answers to. I mean, connect the dots about what he's been doing in this country. He's not tolerating racism, he is promoting racism. He's not tolerating violence, he's inciting racism and violence in this country. So, you know, I don't know what kind of question that is.
For him, any presidential promises would be too little, too late.
In one voice, our nation must condemn racism, bigotry, and white supremacy.
Donald Trump has now outlined his plan, blaming the internet and mental health, but not the guns.
Today, I'm also directing the Department of Justice to propose legislation ensuring that those who commit hate crimes and mass murders face the death penalty, and that this capital punishment be delivered quickly, decisively, and without years of needless delay.
We are gonna change this. We're gonna get this racist president out of the White House.
There was a lot of blame here tonight, laid at the door of the White House. Is that how you feel?
100%, yes.
Why?
He has painted us as people who steal, people who murder, people who kill, just ugly, hateful people, and that painted a target on our back for other people who don't like immigrants. It shouldn't be that easy to get an AK-47 and not get a visa.
Manuel Oliver's son, Joaquin, was killed in the Parkland school shooting. He's finishing a mural in El Paso and sharing a piece of advice. When politicians say now isn't the time to talk about gun control, they're wrong. It's the only time, he says, anyone might listen.
A little while ago, I spoke to Joshua Gelts, visiting professor of law at Georgetown University in Washington, and was senior director for counterterrorism at the National Security Council under the Obama administration. I asked him if it was fair to link President Trump's words at rallies to white supremacist attacks.
The causal relationship is always tough to determine. Radicalization is a complicated, often lengthy process, and it's often hard to figure out exactly what pushes somebody over that edge, so to speak, into violence. But there are many, many politicians in this country who have for a long time, and even today, talk about immigration in ways that don't verge into the sort of racism we see from Donald Trump. They've been able to engage on those issues across the political spectrum without avoiding that sort of language. And the reason it seems fair, especially after the events of the past few days, to urge something better from Donald Trump is not just because it's the right thing to do, but because, at least based on initial reporting, at least one of those suspected of these horrible acts of violence appear to have picked up on this and to have picked up on the idea of immigrants as somehow an invasion of this country.
There was a federal unit targeting white supremacist groups. I mean, why do you think it was wound down?
That is a great question, I think, without a great answer. You know, I was in government during the Obama administration when we worked very hard to build entities designed to address violent extremism quite deliberately of all forms. That's because it doesn't matter if you're the victim of a violent attack of politically motivated violence, whether the ideology was jihadism or white supremacism or whatever else. It's still the same awful loss of life, potentially. And yet it wasn't even months into this administration before the push was made to roll that back. Certain grants that had tentatively been allocated not for jihadist extremism, but instead for right-wing extremism were revoked. And there's been a pathway of a couple years now in which this administration appears unwilling to show leadership on this particular issue.
How easy, then, with your experience, do you think it would be to get a grip on this?
Counterterrorism isn't easy, and it's only fair to acknowledge that. It's also only fair to acknowledge that there are people within federal, state, and local law enforcement who, with the authorities they have right now, are doing the best they can. They're doing their best to run down leads and to try to keep Americans safe. and of course to try to figure out responsibility when something awful does happen and bring the perpetrator to justice. But there are things we could do to help those who are working on it. We could take the existing federal statutory definition of terrorism, not just international terrorism, but terrorism of all forms, and attach criminal penalties to it. We could remove the existing federal statutory restriction on the National Counterterrorism Center, which prevents it from fusing intelligence about domestic terrorism and analyzing that intelligence the same way that NCTC does about international terrorism. So there are people working hard on it. It will always be hard work, but we could also help them through improved executive branch leadership and legislative reform.
Joshua Gelts, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We have a white nationalist terror problem, declared the editorial board of the New York Times today, warning that the virulent ideology of white supremacy was being spread across the world by anonymous online forums like 8chan, filled with posts eulogizing acts of violence and celebrating mass murder. President Trump has declared that the perils of the internet would not be ignored. But what, if anything, can be done to stop the messages of hate from spreading uncontrolled? Simien Brown reports.
Keep going. Run out that way. Keep going. Keep going.
This was the scene from El Paso, when over 20 shoppers were murdered due to the resurgence of a dangerous ideology fueled by websites like this one. 8chan is one of many alt messenger sites with typically outdated interfaces, publishing even more outdated views. Views so inflammatory, even a man criticized for his online conduct has condemned.
We must recognize that the internet has provided a dangerous avenue to radicalize disturbed minds and perform demented acts. We must shine light on the dark recesses of the internet and stop mass murders before they start.
Alt messenger sites appear to be enabling a chain of white extremist terror. In October last year, a man suspected of killing 11 in Pittsburgh posted comments on Gab, a website well known by neo-Nazis. And minutes before the El Paso shooting took over 20 lives, a manifesto was published on 8chan. That manifesto praised the attack in Christchurch, New Zealand, where 51 were killed in March. A document justifying those killings also appeared on the same site. It said that attack drew inspiration from the actions of Anders Breivik, who in 2011 murdered 77 people in Norway. No platform has escaped the resurgent far right. Even Facebook and Twitter are struggling. But unlike them, alt sites like 8chan encourage and even seek out extremists.
8chan was essentially founded during an event in America known as Gamergate. I was one of the women targeted by this. It was a just unbelievably nasty group. They sent me rape threats. They sent me death threats. They went as far as diagramming out my home so people could come in and commit a mass shooting to murder my family. They attempted to destroy my video game studio. It is really probably one of the very worst corners of the internet, feeding our darkest, our absolutely darkest impulses.
Today, Cloudflare, the company providing the security software that allowed 8chan to stay online, gave into pressure to stop protecting them. Cloudflare called 8chan lawless and guilty of creating a hate-filled community. But is the rise of the far right solely the product of sites like 8chan? The academics tracking extremism online say no.
There are a number of contributing factors to that. It's never completely gone away. The internet has definitely increased the visibility of some of these arguments and ideas, whereas previously they might have been quite hard to find and you'd have to seek them out proactively. But we're also in a time when the political culture isn't enabling that kind of conversation and is legitimizing in the group's eyes the kind of ideas that we're seeing spread online on these kind of alt-tech and fringe sites.
So as the world is faced with rising far-right terror, what's worrying is that the extremist ideas behind attacks like the one here are no longer confined to the fringes of society or the dark web.
Well, a little earlier I spoke to Fernando Garcia, who's in El Paso. He's also the founding director of the Border Network for Human Rights. I began by asking him why he thinks his community was targeted in this way.
El Paso, it is becoming a symbol. It has been a symbol of resistance to all of this anti-immigrant agenda of this administration in the United States. is in El Paso, where they had separated children from mothers. In El Paso, we had seen children dying in detention centers and refugees being turned back to Mexico and rejected. And we had resisted every of those instances. So El Paso also at the same time has welcomed immigrants. We open our homes, our city, to refugees. And it seems that they are punishing us because of that. And so now we know more about this manifesto of the shooter, and we cannot ignore that situation. I mean, it seems like the rhetoric, the racist rhetoric, the hate, the xenophobia were the main elements to fuel the action of this shooter. And also at the same time, we cannot disconnect that rhetoric to the President of the United States.
What do you think then about President Trump's reaction today? Because he began by initially tweeting about getting strong background checks, perhaps marrying this with desperately needed immigration reform. He then seemed to change his tack in a speech later. But what do you think about his overall reaction?
You know, there was a moment that he wanted to link the shooting in El Paso to mental health issues. And again, I mean, clearly that was not the case in El Paso. Clearly, you know, just in the past few months ago, we saw the white supremacist militias coming down to El Paso. And they were telling us that they were coming because they were responding to Trump's call to action to protect the border from the invasion. And those are the exact same words, not only that the shooter used, but also that the president has used in the past. So in one way or the other, the president is responsible, and he must be accountable.
Well, he has said today that white supremacy has no place in America. It must be defeated. Is that enough?
No, it's not enough. It's not enough because for more than 2 years, he has been demonizing immigrants. That shouting of send her back, he didn't do anything about it. And for many months, he was insisting in building this racist wall at the border. And now it seems that his slogan previous to this incident was to deport every immigrant in this country, to reject every refugee. So it's not enough. It's not enough. He needs to stop not only the language, but also he needs to stop every strategy, every policy that is rejecting refugees, incarcerating children, and he definitely needs to embrace a different vision for America, because what he has done so far, it is not what we represent.
Fernando Garcia, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.